Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this video series, we'd like to do a crash course on Revelation. We call Revelation Simplified. In this first part, we're going to talk about the four horses of the apocalypse as they show up in the Torah of Moshe, or what's called the laws of Moses. Or more accurately, we're going to talk about the four horses as they show up in the book of Genesis. And this might raise some eyebrows. People might say, where do you get the four horses of the apocalypse in the book of Genesis? The four horses show up in Revelation. Well, we're going to take a look. In passages such as Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 10, we're told that Yahweh declares the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things which are not yet done. And one of the things that prophecy students understand is that the first 5 books of Moses, and in particular the book of Genesis, contain prophecies, and they also establish patterns, things which will repeat themselves again and again and again as we go through Scripture. Now, this crash course on Revelation Simplified is designed, at least in part, to help you understand the news. So if those of you who are subscribed to the Nazarene Revelation newsletter, it's going to help you understand the news as it's playing out today. But this is only a small part of the details that we cover in the full study, Revelation and the End Times, which you can read for free on the website, nazareneisrael.org. You can also download a PDF copy for free. Or if you're a paperback person, you can order a paperback copy at our cost from Amazon.com. And in this first section, we're also going to show several things about the migrations of the tribes. Now, there's some beliefs out there that do some strange things with the migrations. This is not a British Israel hypothesis, but what we show, one of many things that we show in the Nazarene Israel study, is how today's Christians descend from the biblical patriarch Joseph and his 2 sons. And again, this has nothing to do with race. This simply shows the mechanics of how these things came about historically. And if you have questions for details on that, I highly recommend the Nazarene Israel study. So when we get into the next part, we're going to talk about the first 4 seals and how at the first 4 seals there's released a horse of a different color. The first horse, we'll talk about this in the next part as well, but the first horse that's released is a white horse. And we're going to see that this represents the descendants of the biblical patriarch Joseph. Then we're going to see also released at the second seal, we're going to see a red horse. And we're going to see how this represents the descendants of the biblical Esau, who is spiritually now he dwells in Rome. And then the black horse we're going to see represents the descendants of Judah, or what's called the Jews today. And the green horse, the King James Version reads pale, but the green horse represents the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's first son. So we want to back up just a little bit. We want to get the full scope of these things. So we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 5 and verse 32. And Genesis 5 and verse 32 tells us that when Noah was 500 years old, he begot Shem and Ham and also Japheth. Now these 3 were the sons of Noah. So Shem populated the Middle East, and then he also traveled east. His descendants went east. So Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, India, China, Japan, crossing the land bridge into the Americas, North and South America. These are all, at least the genetic descendants, they're primarily Shemites. Ham, the name means hot, and so Ham went south into Africa where the climate is hotter. And then Japheth, we know, traveled north into Europe. We take a look at the name Japheth. It's Strong's Old Testament 33:15, Japheth, and it refers to expansion. So that is a characteristic of the Japhethite people, is that they tend to expand. So we take a look historically at the white Christian empires of Europe and their expansion. This is not necessarily a function of them being Christian. This is a function of them being Japhethite and then spreading to the New World and establishing colonies. And of course, there was a time when the sun never set on the British Empire. But let's take a look at some of the prophecies. In Genesis 9 and verse 27, we see one of the farthest reaching prophecies ever uttered. So this is where Genesis 9 and verse 27, Noah says, "May Elohim," or God, "enlarge Japheth," whose name already means expansive, "and may he dwell in the tents of Shem." and make Canaan be his servant. So what he's talking about here in context about dwelling in the tents of Shem is he's saying that in context, we're talking about the Middle East, and we're talking about a day when the descendants, both physical and prophetic, of the Japhethites are going to return back home to the land of Israel, and they're going to dwell in the Middle East. Now, some people tie this to what Yeshua says at Matthew chapter 8 and verse 11, when Yeshua says, "And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." He says, "But the sons of kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So in context, what we're talking about is there will be a time when those who are presently dwelling in the kingdom in the land of Israel, which is our Orthodox Jewish brethren right now, there's going to be a series of devastating wars over there. And after this series of devastating wars, which we're going to talk about in later portions of this video, after this series of devastating wars, then the sons of Joseph are going to return from east and west and sit down in the kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who believe on Yeshua. So before we talk about that, first thing we want to do is we want to talk about a basic history of the patriarchs. And by patriarchs, we mean Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham's first son was named Ishmael, and Ishmael was the son of Hagar. It was Sarai's or Sarah's handmaiden. And we know that Yahweh loves Ishmael. And right now it's a very difficult thing because Ishmael is tied to Islam, and Islam is associated with a lot of damage that's happening all around the world. But we know that Yahweh loves Ishmael. We're going to take a closer look at this as we go through and continue through this video series. For example, in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 20, we read, "So Elohim was with the lad." Elohim was with Ishmael, and you're not with someone unless you love them. It says, "And he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer." So we talk about the wilderness, we're talking about the wilderness of Paran. And the wilderness of Paran is in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. It's south of the land of Israel. Israel's in the upper left-hand corner of this image. And it's where Mecca and Medina are located. It's widely considered to be the cradle of Islam, and as we're going to see later, this is where the green horse arose. So it's interesting. Now we see that this is where Ishmael moved to, and we're also going to see how Ishmael's wife was taken from Egypt. That'll tie in later. But this is also where Muhammad later gave rise to Islam. So Ishmael moved in, and then later this is the location where Muhammad arises. And the Muslims are very aware of this linkage. So as we'll see later, especially in part 2 of this video, that's the green horse. So continuing on in Genesis 25 and verse 21, and also just to throw it in, the part about Ishmael being an archer, Ishmael was very strong with actual archery weapons back in the Middle Ages. Today they tend to use more missiles, but again, we're still talking about projectile weapons. So continuing on to Esau, in Genesis 25 and verse 21, Isaac pleaded with Yahweh for his wife because she was barren. And Yahweh granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children, verse 22, but the children struggled together within her. The word in Hebrew is ratzatz. It means literally they're trying to break each other apart. They're literally trying to break each other in pieces. And so she said, "If all is well, why am I this way?" So she went to inquire of Yahweh. Verse 23, and Yahweh said to her, "Two nations," he's talking about Esau and Yaakov, he said, "two nations are in your womb, and two peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older," in this case referring to Esau, "shall serve the younger." So what we know is that the older Esau is going to end up serving Jacob. And we'll see that Jacob gives birth to Judah and Joseph, the patriarchs of the Jews and also of the Christians. So verse 24. So when the days were fulfilled for Rebekah, for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. Verse 25. And the first, Esau, came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. And this is what in Hebrew is known as a remez, or a hint. So Esau came out red, and we'll see later that Esau represents the red horse. So verse 26. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Yaakov. And in Hebrew, Yaakov means he shall grasp the heel. So one of the problems is that Esau, being older, was heir to the birthright or the kingship. But Esau despised the birthright. So he despised the duties of the kingship. He didn't care about them. And this is a problem because whoever's in office, whoever's in power in a certain nation, it has everything to say about the success or failure of that nation. And Esau didn't care about the success or failure of the nation. He was more into hunting and fishing and doing his own thing. So Yaakov, it was right for him to do this. In Genesis 25 and verse 31, Yaakov traded Esau out of the birthright, just simply for a bowl of stew or pottage. So it says, Yaakov said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And because Esau didn't care about the birthright, he traded it away. That's all well and good. Now the problem comes in is that the birthright and the blessing go together. Now the blessing is the financial blessings and all sorts of other blessings that are needed in order when you're in the kingship, because the kingship requires more resources in order to take care of the job effectively. So Rebekah, Yaakov's mother, effectively puts Yaakov up to deceiving his father out of the blessing that his father Isaac was going to give to Esau. So we read about it in the story in Genesis chapter 27 and verse 24. So Isaac said, "Are you really my son Esau?" And Yaakov said, "I am." So there was a deception that took place. And because Yaakov deceived, he also was deceived in the matter of his wives, in the matter of his wages with Lavan, and in all sorts of other matters. Because Yaakov deceived, he also was deceived. So and there were other problems with this as well. Esau was not happy. So in Genesis 27 and verse 41, we read that Esau hated Yaakov because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And so Esau said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Yaakov." So anger is the color of red. So again, we see the red horse. So but Esau, Yaakov being the father of Judah and Joseph, Yaakov's children would dwell in the land of Israel because he's who the promise came from. Esau, for his part, dwelt in Mount Seir, which is in southwestern Jordan. And it's north of the wilderness of Paran, which we just saw. So basically, you might say Mount Seir was halfway in between the wilderness of Paran, where Ishmael dwelt, and the land of Israel. And some people might say that this is one of the reasons why the Pope tries to play an intermediary role in between Christians and Jews and the Muslims, is because he dwells, so to speak, halfway in between the two camps. And later in this series, in part 2 and other places, we're going to see how today the spirit of Esau lives on, but lives on in the Vatican City in Rome. So that's the green and red horses. And now we're going to talk about the black and white horses. So Yaakov then had 12 sons by his 4 wives. So Leah gave birth to a very special son by the name of Judah, who is the patriarch of the Jews as we know them today. Sometimes people think of the Jews as being all 12 tribes. That's not correct. Israel is all 12 tribes. Judah is only 2 or perhaps 3 of the tribes, but they have a special role. They're the leader of one of what's called the 2 houses. We'll talk about in just a moment. Rachel also gave birth to a special son by the name of Joseph. And as we've already talked about, Joseph was the forerunner of the Christian peoples. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But we're going to see a very special relationship go on between Judah and Joseph. Some very special. And Judah's not always very kind. He's not always very ethical towards Joseph. And Joseph is not always as wise, at least in his early years. He's not as wise toward Judah as he will be in his later years. But there comes a point of time in the book where Judah sells Joseph into slavery in Egypt. Now, Egypt, we know, is a type of the world or the world system. And this is a prophetic foreshadowing of how Judah would also kill the Messiah and send his disciples out into the world, which again, the world is a type of Egypt. So they would go out into the world then in order to seek out the lost and scattered children of Joseph and his two sons. So while Joseph is there in Egypt, he begets two sons. The oldest son's name is Manasseh, and as we show in the Nazarene Israel study, at least at one level, and there's more levels, there's more than one level, but at least at one of the levels, Manasseh represents the United Kingdom, the remains of the British Empire. And the younger son is going to represent, the younger son's name is Ephraim or Ephraim, and at least at one level, he represents the United States of America. Now, there's a global Ephraimite movement, and there's many more levels. The Ephraimite movement is worldwide, but we'll talk more about that as we go. But to look at this in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 41 and verse 51, Yosef called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For Elohim has made me forget. The name Manasseh refers to forgetting. For Elohim has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. Well, Manasseh forgot his toil because the Industrial Revolution, for all intents and purposes, got underway in England. So it made Manasseh's life much easier that way. And he also forgot his father's house, in that we can see a lot of anti-Semitic comments and activity taking place in England and in the United Kingdom. So, so here's Manasseh, and his name means to forget. But notice it also refers to the tribe descended from him, his physical descendants, and also his territory. Now, the name in Genesis 41 and verse 52, the name of the second son, Yosef called Ephraim. For he says, for Elohim has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So we look this name up, Ephraim, and it's Strong's Old Testament 669. Now it's a dual of the masculine form of 672, which we'll see in just a moment. And it means double fruit or doubly fruitful. So we take a look at this reference at 672, and we see it's Ephrath. So Ephraim is related to Ephrath. And Ephrath means fruitfulness, but it's also another name for Bethlehem. And we know that Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin in Bethlehem, Ephrathah. So in fact, there's a number of things that we can take a look at with regards to Bethlehem and its being a place of fruitfulness, those where the fruitful ones come forth. So Bethlehem Ephrathah is where Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. Rachel, we know, is also the mother of Joseph. King David was born there. The King of Kings, Messiah Yeshua, was also born there. And we know that Yeshua was sent for the sons of Joseph, and Joseph's sons included Ephraim and Manasseh. So just a very interesting link between the Messiah and bearing fruit. And we know that the Messiah has some parables about the fig trees that do and do not bear fruit and this kind of a thing. But there's a sequence of 8 nations, and we're going to see this sequence again many, many times. There's a sequence of 8 nations that will plague and afflict the nation of Israel. And the first of these is Egypt. And so we take a look at Egypt. Israel went into Egypt for 430 years. And at the end of that time, Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, and Joshua or Yehoshua or Yeshua, same name as the Messiah, brought them into the land of Israel. And after this, we had a period of some 480 years called the era of Judges. Now, we're going to see some very important things about this that, again, pertain to Judah and Joseph. So we're going to see 2 tribes in the south. It's going to be the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. It's very important tribes, and some also number Levi in with them because that's where the temple was. But then in the north, we're going to see 10 tribes. We're going to focus on them for a little bit. We're going to see, and these 10 tribes are known as the house of Israel, the house of Ephraim, and they're also called Joseph. And so this schism that existed between the children of Judah and the children of Joseph now, it's going to take on a much larger dimension as we move further on through scripture prophecy. So after the era of Judges, now we're going to see the difference between the tribes becomes much larger. So after the era of Judges comes the era of Kings. And first we had King Shaul or King Saul. And after that, we had Kings David and Solomon. Now, one of the problems with King Solomon is that King Solomon worshipped idols. And he married too many foreign wives. And his wives led him into idol worship. Because of this very great sin, the kingdom, the nation of Israel was going to be split into two kingdoms. And we would have the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Ephraim in the north, and the kingdom of Judah with its two tribes in the south. So what at first was a rivalry going on between the brothers, now it's going to take there's a separation between the kingdoms. So we're going to take a look at the northern kingdom first. This northern kingdom is called Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. So a lot of people, a lot of Christians especially, when they read through the prophecies and they read about the northern kingdom of Israel, they think they're reading about the Jews, and this is not the case. They're reading about what later became the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So the kingdom of Israel is also called the kingdom of Ephraim, and again, it's also called Joseph because Ephraim was Joseph's son. And the capital city name was Samaria, and the king of the northern kingdom committed some very grave sins, a man by the name of Jeroboam. One of the main things he did is he changed the places of worship, and he set up idols in those new places of worship, setting up golden calves in Dan and Bethel. He also changed the dates of the worship. He moved the fall festivals back a month. And then he also established a new priesthood that was not descended from the tribe of Levi. And so point for point, this is effectively what the Catholic Church would later do, is they would change the places of worship to Rome and then other cathedrals and other cities around the globe. They're going to change the dates of worship. They're going to move the Passover back to Easter, and they're going to move the Feast of Tabernacles back to December the 25th and Christmas. And they're also going to have a new priesthood that is not of the sons of Levi. Now, these are all very grave sins, breaking many of the major commandments that are written right there in stone. Not to have any idols, not to have any other gods before Yahweh's face. Here we even have golden calf worship in two substitute cities and an entirely different priesthood. A whole new religion is formed. Well, as a punishment for these very grave sins, the 10 tribes would be scattered out into the world. They'd be scattered out into the nations like seed to be regathered some 2,730 years later. And we go through and break down and do all the math in the Nazarene Israel study. But just as a summary of it, the Assyrian captivity, the Assyrians were sent in to take the northern kingdom into captivity, and they began taking them away about 732 years BCE, or before Yeshua's birth. So when we add the 2,730 years that it's prophesied that the 10 tribes would spend in the Assyrian captivity, we come up with an end date of the Assyrian spiritual captivity of 1998 CE. And it's no coincidence that this is about when the two-house movement began to take off. It was in the period about 1996 CE to 2000. 1998 CE, for example, I was called in 1999, and there's many others who were called during that time frame. But what we need to understand is this was not just a physical captivity. The Bible's a spiritual book. Scripture speaks about spiritual matters. So we're talking about a spiritual captivity. So when we talk about the Assyrian captivity, it goes by other names. It's also called the dispersion or the diaspora. We read in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 6, it says, "In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria took Samaria," which we saw was the capital city of the northern kingdom, "and carried Israel away to Assyria." So one of the problems that we know is, again, this was not just a physical captivity, because when the Assyrian Empire, and Assyria is to the north of the land of Israel, but after the Assyrian Empire fell, the 10 tribes didn't come back. They continued on out to be scattered into the nations and sent into every country on earth, so that every family, every nation, and every clan would end up with the physical genetics seed of Abraham. There was a part that they played in that. But so we come back to this list of the 8 nations that have affected the land of Israel, the nation of Israel, and we see Assyria in the number 2 position. We'll talk later about how Ishmael might still be held captivity in Egypt, and we're also going to talk about how the 10 tribes are still spiritually captive in Assyria. So it's very important to understand. And again, Syria lies to the north. So the 10 tribes, but very interesting thing, after the Assyrian Empire broke up, again, the tribes moved in all different directions. They went east into Asia, they went down into Africa. We have reason to believe the Phoenicians traveled to the New World, so if any traveled to Phoenicia, again, they would make their way to the New World. We know that they went north into Europe and these kinds of things. But as a prophetic entity, and this is what we explained in the Nazarene Israel study, as a prophetic entity, the house of Ephraim, or the kingdom, the Ephraimites, or the Josephites, or the Israelites of the northern kingdom went north up and were tied into Japheth's country in Europe. Because Japheth, because he's so expansive, Japheth would be used to expand the good news and to take the Great Commission forth to the ends of the earth. And this is why, speaking of things still to come, in Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 12, it tells us that when Yahweh proclaims essentially forgiveness to the Ephraimites, he says, go and proclaim these words toward the north and say, return, backsliding Israel, says Yahweh. And again, that's not anything to do with race. It's just simply saying that the Japhethite Europe was used to spread the good news to all the 4 corners of the globe. But now notice how this all ties in. This is so important. In Luke chapter 4:18, this is where Yeshua stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he's quoting from the book of Isaiah, and he says, the Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted and to proclaim liberty to the captives. Now, a lot of people think that because we are to proclaim liberty to the captives, that means that we're supposed to focus on jail and prison ministries. Now, that's a very good thing to do, is prison ministry, because you literally have a captive audience. But what he's talking about here is those who are still spiritually captive. Our mission and our calling is to preach to those who are still spiritually captive in Egypt. We'll see that that's Ishmael. Those who are still spiritually captive in Assyria, that's the lost 10 tribes. And we're going to see in a moment that we're going to proclaim to those who are in spiritual captivity in Babylon as well. But we know that Yeshua was ministering. Yeshua came for these lost 10 tribes because he tells us this, if we understand what we're reading. For example, in Matthew 15 and verse 24, Yeshua answered and said, I was not sent, meaning on his first trip, except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He's talking about the Ephraimites, the Josephites, the lost 10 tribes. And as we're going to see in part 2 of this video series, he's also again talking about the white horse, those who follow Yeshua. And again, we're talking about the white horse is different from the Catholic red horse, and we'll get into the distinctions and a crossover category we call the pink horse, but we'll talk about that later. So we also see this same understanding reflected in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. He writes, Kepha, or Peter, an apostle of Yeshua Messiah, to the pilgrims of the dispersion. So who he's writing to is he's talking about those Israelites who are still in the Assyrian captivity, meaning the lost 10 tribes, or some might say the 12 tribes. So here James writes to the 12 tribes and not just the 10. So in James 1 and verse 1, we read, Yaakov, a bondservant of Elohim and of Yahweh Yeshua Messiah, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. And the reason Yaakov writes to the 12 tribes and not just the 10 is that when the Assyrian army came in and invaded the land, they didn't stop at the border. This wasn't a quarrel with the northern kingdom. It was simply the Assyrian army trying to expand as much as they could. And in fact, they took all but 3 of the walled cities of Judah, we're told, I believe, in Chronicles. So we have left in the land the remains of 3 of the walled cities of Judah, and then they went on to repopulate the land. So these southern 2, or some say 3 tribes form the house of Judah and later on the kingdom of Judah. Now, one of the problems that Judah, and by and large, Judah obeyed the Torah much better than the northern kingdom of Ephraim did. But still, there were some problems. One of the things Judah did not do is they did not allow the land to rest. And so because of this, and we talk about this in the Nazarene Israel study, but because Judah did not allow the land to rest, they would spend 70 years in punishment in the exile in Babylon. Now, so there were some other difficulties that took place in Babylon that were much worse, much more complicating factors. So some of the problems that the Jews ran into in Babylon is that there was no temple in Babylon. And so because the people had no place to bring their tithes, gifts, and offerings, the Levitical order soon collapsed because no priesthood can long survive without funding. And so the people began to assimilate and become Babylonian in nature. So there was an urgent need to stop this kind of a thing. So the stopgap measure that was created is that the great men of Babylon created what's called the Rabbinical Order. And the thing was, so the Levitical order, people have different duties and different job descriptions, but everyone's still focusing on the word of Yahweh. They're still looking to obey the Torah of Moshe, the laws of Moses. Well, the Rabbinical order is different. So in the Rabbinical order, instead of everyone having different jobs, but they all focus on Yahweh's word, and instead of the Levites pointing to Yahweh's word as their authority, they couldn't do that in the land of Babylon. So they had to come up with some other system. And what they effectively did is they came up with the system of rabbis. So in Hebrew, the term Rav means great. And when you say Ravi or Rabbi or Rabbi, what you're literally saying is, my great one. And so the issue then becomes, and so the rabbis have come up with their own version of the Torah that's based on what they call the Takanot and the Ma'asim, which are traditions and works. But basically what it boils down to is, in Esau, the Pope claims that he has authority to change Scripture. And that's one of the reasons we know that the Pope is Babylonian. And the rabbis also believe that they have the authority to change Scripture when the need arises or when they feel that the need arises. And this is patently against Scripture. So what they're effectively doing is they're basing their own set of commandments on Yahweh's commandments. And that's a very different thing than simply pointing to the authority of Yahweh's commandments. So it sort of elevates them in the same way that the Pope is elevated, so to speak. So this again, when we take a look at the list of the 8 empires which afflict the nation of Israel, we see that Babylon is number 3. And this is also very interesting because then we have Babylon, 4 is Media Persia, 5 is Greece or Macedonia, and then Rome. This is the same as we're going to see in King Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue in Babylon as recorded in Daniel chapter 2. It's simply starting at a later point. It's starting at point 3 of the list of 8 and continuing on from there. So King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, dreamt of a statue that was set up on the earth in 5 parts. The first 4 parts of the statue represented a series of 4 physical empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome, that would conquer and dominate the known world at that time. Then there would be a 5th empire, which would arise out of the 4th empire, and that is Babylonian Roman Christianity. And we'll see as this study progresses, it also includes Islam. So, but because the head of the statue, the head of gold of the statue represented Babylon, where the rabbis dwell, the entire statue would be Babylonian in nature. And this is what we're going to see as we progress through this study, is that we're going to see the rabbis in Babylon and Christianity in Rome and also Islam are the 3 different parts of the Babylonian system. And in fact, as we continue forward, we're going to see that there's 4 parts of the Babylonian system, but we're not ready to see that yet. So I hope that you will join me again for part 2 of this video, where we're going to talk about the 4 horses and the 7 seals. So, and again, I would encourage you all, if you want the full study, to please go to the NazareneIsrael.org website and download the full copy of Revelation in the End Times. May Yahweh be with you. Shalom.